Welcome everybody to the webinar today, Stop Hand Cranking the Manual Sourcing Wheel with Spend Matters and Medius. We've got three people today talking, sharing their views and expertise with you. First of all, myself, I'm Jenny Draper. I'm the General Manager of Spend Matters across Europe and the UK.
Hi there, everybody. My name's Daniel Ball. I was a founding director of Wax Digital, more of which in a minute, and I am now the VP of Innovation for Medius.
Hello, I'm Jurgita Andrijauskaite, and I'm Solutions Consultant for SaaS contract products for Medius.
Great, thanks Daniel and Gita for that. So, if I take you onto the agenda, here's what we are going to cover for you today. We have a really packed webinar for you with a lot of content. So what we recommend in terms of questions at the end is actually to submit your questions via the questions button that you'll see on this webinar, and then the questions will be answered once the webinar has finished, and you'll get your responses from the Medius Group directly. So here's an overview of what we're going to do, and I'm going to move swiftly into giving you a couple of introductions of the two organisations involved. First of all, Spend Matters, and that's who I'm with. If you don't know Spend Matters already, then please take a look, because Spend Matters is an organisation that really is all about research and analyst opinion around source-to-pay technology. When buying organisations are making decisions on tech switches and looking into functionality of technology, then they will come to Spend Matters, first of all for our opinions and research, and also for our scoring. We tear technology apart and do lots of scoring. So it's my pleasure to bring our thoughts from Spend Matters to this webinar today. And I'm going to hand over as well to Daniel to give you a little bit more of an overview of Medius.
Thanks, Jenny. And on that point, obviously, I guess some people on today's webinar, or many of you, will know us as and have been invited by Wax Digital to this session. So apologies for any confusion here. But in November 2019, Wax was acquired by Medius, and as a consequence, the Wax brand is being ultimately retired globally and replaced by the Medius brand as we become essentially one organization. You know, we're very much one company now, and in the future you will see us exclusively appear under the Medius brand. So if you weren't sure why, when you thought you were attending a Wax Digital webinar, you've come to a Medius one, that's why. It's the same company now, and as I say, going forward you'll recognize us under the Medius brand. And as Medius, you know, we're a much bigger organization now. We've got over 3,500 customers globally, and we've got offices around the world, processing over $150 billion of spend annually on behalf of our customers. But I think, you know, what's still absolutely fundamental to us is a focus on customers, a focus on customer success. So, you know, that 98% customer retention statistic that you see in the top left-hand side there is still to us the singular mark of our success. And you know, we're very pleased in having come together with Medius, who have very much the same kind of focus on customers, on getting it right for customers, and on ensuring that customers are, you know, front and center of everything that we do as an organization. And that's whilst we continue obviously to deliver what we would certainly propose to be class-leading solutions for spend management, you know, right the way through the procurement cycle. But now, I guess, stronger than ever in the AP automation space, thanks to Medius's long track history and specialization in that area. So, you know, I think in combination, we have a solution suite that brings the best of both worlds, really, to both the CPO, the purchasing director, and to the CFO, the finance director, coming from both angles of that, or both ends of that procurement purchase to pay life cycle.
And if you want to know a little bit more about Medius as well as the Wax and the history there, of course you can look at that on the Spend Matters website as well. So back to our webinar today, in defining e-sourcing. it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we sourcing and e-sourcing has been around for some time now, and here we are revisiting e-sourcing and sourcing yet again in 2020, and that just shows what a hot topic it still is. So first of all, let's just go back to the roots of sourcing and what it is really and how we define it. Well, it came to life in the 1980s as a term, and that's sourcing, thanks to the likes of McKinsey and A.T. Kearney. And then in the 1990s, and this is really courtesy of free markets, I'm a veteran of the free markets team, they developed technology around the sourcing process, the negotiation process. And from that, the term e-sourcing was coined, and that allowed organizations to negotiate online. In those days, it was more basic around basically reverse auctions and so on. And then as time has gone on, then this has been really developed with much more functionality. So typically sourcing and e-sourcing follows the following steps really. First of all, demand analysis. This is all about opportunity analysis, looking at what you're spending and looking at what can be sourced, and if there is the volume and a supply market there for your goods or services in terms of sourcing. The next step that one would go through in this area is developing the market assessment, so understanding if there is a contested market, if there is a market and an opportunity for what you want to buy, and then developing a strategy around that, including a negotiation strategy, and looking at what you want out of your supply base from this opportunity. Following that, you're going into strategy execution. That's executing what strategy you developed, whether that's going to be online or offline. Is that a reverse auction? Is it an RFP? How you're going to proceed with that. And then, of course, it's implementing the results, selecting your suppliers, awarding to your suppliers, and implementing those results. You know, we use the term sourcing or e-sourcing, but actually these are fundamental steps that you've always been doing. If you're a buyer in a buying organization, you've always been doing this. It's perhaps not just been framed in this way, and every organization sources goods or services. But of course, what is the tipping point to consider when you move from emailing your known suppliers and using Excel spreadsheets and MS Office, Microsoft Office? When do you move from that phase to something which is considered more electronic? So let's just have a look at that on the next slide. So what is the tipping point? Well, first of all, if you have a procurement function, then you can source and you should be sourcing electronically. There really is no barriers to sourcing electronically, and we'll go into that through the course of this presentation, of this discussion. And if you're not doing that, then you really are missing out. First of all, and something that people really use sourcing for is that savings potential. Reaching deeper, wider savings across the amount that you are spending, whether that's great or small. Extending the sourcing opportunity to a wider set of suppliers, not just perhaps ones that you've been negotiating with over previous years and previous sourcing rounds. Into reporting facilities as well. I think as a world, as a world of businesses coming together, reporting and indeed the next point, audit trail, has become so much more important to all of us. Having that visibility, having that record of trust, having that record of what we've been doing in our organisations, and that is a really compelling reason why people go towards looking at electronically sourcing, e-sourcing. So these are some pointers in terms of why you should be thinking and what the tipping point for you in your organisation is. The next thing I want to go a little bit deeper really is the point of departure from going to the E, from moving from sourcing to e-sourcing. And that really comes from getting better pricing, as we've talked about. Now, what does that mean for us? That means percentage savings, getting better pricing from the organisations that we're dealing with, and also knowing that there is more of a market out there in order to have a competitive landscape to create that. Does your spend justify an investment in technology? The barrier to entry in this area is so low these days that if you're answering these questions positively, then you should really be looking towards that investment. Having as well a clear, if one of your objectives is having a clear team-wide view of all of the information in your organisation around sourcing, then you need to consider a single platform. I think this has been historically an issue for many organisations, is knowing what are the discussion points between suppliers and buying organisations. Where is that information? Where is that audit trail? And getting that into some kind of consistent process, consistent visibility as well is absolutely critical for many organisations, and it should be. Reporting, as I said earlier, is much more rigorous, and that data at fingertips approach is really required from the most senior stakeholders in any organisation down. I think something that people don't consider as much, and they really should, is around casting that net wider to the supply base. I think in terms of not sourcing via platforms, it is very difficult to then manually deal with many more suppliers. So actually handling 5 suppliers, 6 suppliers via email, negotiation and discussion and telephone is a handful in itself. And having a platform available makes that mass communication much more simple, much more effective and efficient. And that's really one of the points as well that organisations consider in moving forward. And then, of course, the audit trail, as I've said before, is having all of this in one repository is absolutely key to making those decisions. So if you're looking at these points and thinking, yes, this resonates with us as an organisation, then you're likely at that tipping point moving to e-sourcing. And then if you look at your own business as in its profile really, and considering not just the situation with regards to some key areas I've just discussed, but actually looking at where are we now as an organisation versus where do we want to be. I think first of all, don't try and crack everything all at once. So look at that gap analysis from where you are today to where you want to get to. How do you source now? And what is that gap to get into a light version of e-sourcing? Even if you're just looking at 1 or 2 categories, what is that next step to make it manageable for you and your organisation? What value spend do you have? And in terms of category spend, is there a contested market? And when was the last time that you negotiated your categories? I want to take a moment here to just dispel a couple of myths, I think. I have seen many successful e-sourcing events, whether they're reverse auctions or electronic RFPs, that have been a value of $30,000 in certain categories, and that has been a hugely contested market. So when people think about running, whether it's reverse auctions or electronic RFPs, very often people think, well, my spend doesn't count because I don't have $500,000, I don't have $1 million in this area, I've not got the right environment for it to happen. I dispel those myths completely, because if you have got a category, 1 or 2 categories, where you have got a competitive market for any value that is considered competitive in that area, then, and you have suppliers that want your business, then you have got the right environment to consider e-sourcing. So there are certain things to look at in that area. Does, as well, the next big point really here, does a good portion of my spend lend itself to e-sourcing? Relatively easy. You would not want to start e-sourcing with very strategic direct spend. You would want to do this on indirect categories typically to start with, and then move forward into more complex areas as well. And do I have access to the spend? If your organization is global or is not centralized, then you might find it difficult to get access to that spend or to understand when that spend becomes available to renegotiate. So these are areas you need to look at when considering that those baby steps to starting your e-sourcing journey. So in terms of those first steps to the e-sourcing, I think it's absolutely critical, first of all, to do those litmus tests I've just mentioned in terms of looking at your own organization, looking at your spend, you know, just making sure that you've got certain opportunities available to go down this road. And I think the next area really is getting your team, looking inside your organization, looking at your team, get them on board to eSource, look at your structure, look at who's within your team and creating the right structure. Very often we see that the most successful structures are actually creating a dedicated sourcing team for negotiation around, you know, aside from that category structure. And that's something to think of for the future, but really start with getting that team on board. Nominate e-sourcing champions from within procurement. You might have one or two people that show real key interest and know that they will work to make this happen and create the right environment for it to happen within the procurement team. Articulate the benefits and outline an e-sourcing plan, an early sourcing plan, and articulate those benefits not only to your own procurement team, but then looking at the wider organization as well. Socialize that plan, and you're going to be successful if you can get key business stakeholders on board as influencers as well. So if you have certain people within the organization that see the benefits, align with them and bring them into helping support what you want to do in the organization. And as well, I think a final point as well is outline as well what you want from e-sourcing technology. What do you want e-sourcing to be for your organization, and what will that mean in terms of functionality and platform for you as well? So get these key fundamentals down before you progress to the next stage. So my question to you is, what is stopping you? And this is something that we're going to go through in much more detail during this presentation with Daniel and Gita. Why don't procurement teams move to e-sourcing? Because people still see that there are barriers, even in 2020 and beyond. There are still many people that don't e-source, and here are some reasons why that I think need to be addressed in many organizations. First of all, the fear of getting it wrong. You know, what happens if the technology doesn't work? What happens if I can't get the people internally on board, if it's just a complete flop and I've invested in it? It's often getting over that first hurdle of that before you then start to invest. Overhead to implementing software, and I think this is something that will really come out in terms of overcoming the barriers to considering this as an overhead and implementing that software. Is there a huge amount of process change required in what I do to move to e-sourcing? Will I get stakeholder resistance or inertia? Will people really be bothered about this? Can I move this forward, and can I create change within the organization? Do I have budget to actually bring in electronic sourcing, to bring in a platform to do this? And as well, and something that I still come across is that fear of exposure. What if people look at what I've been doing? What if we get great savings now, and then people look at my spend and say, well, hold on, what have you been doing for the past 20 years if we've just managed to get 20% savings? And that level of exposure is also a barrier, but I think it shouldn't be, because this, and it really mustn't be, because electronic sourcing, it changes everything. It changes the whole dynamics around negotiation and sourcing. And with that, I want to move forward onto some more explanation of what we're doing in this area with Medius as well, and Daniel.
Brilliant, thanks a lot for that, Jenny. And yeah, I think, you know, what I'm going to try and do over the next few slides is really address some of those issues and some of those fears, if you like, and talk about actually, what is required, what is a prerequisite, some of the things that you have to look out for, but also, how attainable getting to, an e-sourcing platform and e-sourcing as a standardized process within procurement really is. And I think, the start out for that is all about overcoming that fear of getting it wrong, getting past that kind of, paralysis by analysis that can take hold when you're faced with lots of different options and potentially a roadmap to getting to e-sourcing that you're not particularly familiar with or comfortable with. And a lot of that is because, if you haven't done it before, or even if not just recently, then implementing a new technology solution and changing working practices to accommodate that can seem like an insurmountably large project, especially obviously since everyone has day jobs to do. So making the time and creating the focus around a project like this, well, it just never seems to be the right moment. But of course, the answer to that is not to eat the elephant all at once, but to do so, one bite at a time. And we'll go on to talk about that, but I think there are two key steps to get right at the outset, and Jenny touched on both of these, and just kind of to underline them. The first of those steps is the kind of the planning side of things, to set out the as-is and the to-be processes. Just ask yourself, if I look at the last 10 tender exercises we've run, what was the process we went through? Is it rigidly defined and the same every time, or was it pretty ad hoc? Influenced by all sorts of things like the spend category, the number of suppliers that we might have available, the criticality of the category, and of course who the different stakeholders were that were involved, and then crystallize that into a kind of a defined and a repeatable as is, which a lot of people often think they know until they come to actually write it down. And then particularly when they ask everybody else that might be involved whether they agree with what the as-is process is. So that can be a trickier thing than it might at first appear, but it gives you kind of the baseline of, okay, well, this is how the process that we have today, the manual process essentially, this is how it works, this is what it looks like. And then once you've got that, identify what the weak points in that process are, where the complexity, the unnecessary overheads, the poor practice, the leakages, and then look to address those, of course, in your to-be process. And any provider should be able to help you with that, should be able to provide you with a good template that says this is the kind of the best practice standard process. And you should be able then to flex that to meet your particular requirements. And then I think simplify it again. In the first instance, it might be that you actually only look to address part of the to-be process, but you have a longer term view, at least in mind, and set down a roadmap for where you want to take things. And the other key step, I think, is to identify your process and systems owner. And again, Jenny touched on this. It's absolutely vital that you have somebody, and that person could, of course, be you, but equally it might be somebody else in your team who owns all the aspects of the process and the system. They're the go-to person for system use, for knowledge, for training, for administration, and so on. But more important than all of that, in many respects, they're the advocate, they're the champion. And as such, they should have good people skills, really, to engage and to persuade other users and stakeholders onto this kind of journey, if you like. Okay, so kind of with those basic precepts in place, what is important when it comes, first of all, to selecting your software? Well, I think the main question here is, how do you intend to use it? What are your core requirements? Which essentially boils down to, are you running relatively straightforward negotiations on categories like PPE, like audit services, raw materials, all sorts of categories, but actually relatively straightforward negotiations? Or do you need a platform for highly complex categories, for example, global shipping, as we see here on the right, where scenario building, advanced optimization, allowing you to model different outcomes and variables are essential. If it's the latter, then you need to look at some of the more kind of highly advanced specialist providers on the market. But those solutions are generally very over-engineered if what you're looking to do is what most procurement teams are looking to do, which is to source widely and quickly and efficiently across a wide range of categories. So just as an example here, you know, these are just some of the events that customers of ours have run in recent months. And as you can see, they span a huge variety of different category types, you know, products and services and so on. So it doesn't mean that you're in any way constrained, but I think, you know, as I say, if you don't need those highly sophisticated and complex kind of sourcing optimization practices and processes built in, then you're much better off with a fit for purpose, if you like, sourcing solution. Don't focus necessarily on, you know, bells and whistles that you'll never use. Consider what the features and functions are that are really important to you. And then, because many of the platforms that you'll evaluate will be very similar in that regard, you know, just as importantly in many respects is what kind of provider you want to work with. And in our experience, that generally boils down to 5 things. So firstly, do they have similar clients? So, you know, does the client profile of the vendor look somewhat like you, or certainly can they evidence a lot of organizations that look like you that are using the software? Are they growing? How quickly are they growing? How successful as a provider are they in the market? You know, that momentum has a lot about business confidence. It has, you know, the support. It has the product investment behind it, and so on. So look at, you know, how they're performing in the market. The people. So do you get on with the people? Do you think that they, you know, you can work with these people as vendors, as suppliers to you for the next, you know, hopefully 5, 10, 15, 20 years? What about upgrades and the journey? So do they upgrade the software on a regular basis, you know, monthly or quarterly as a minimum, so that it's a continually growing and evolving platform? And do they have other modules that you can grow out to if you want to? So if you want to add contract management, if you want to add supplier relationship management and holistically grow that suite at some point in the future, do you have the capability to do that with the single provider that you select? And then finally, aligned services or plugins. You know, are there services from other third-party providers that you can leverage through your investment in this platform? So whether that be, you know, risk data from Dun & Bradstreet, whether it be geolocation data, whether it be financial data about suppliers, those kind of things. You may never want to use those facilities, but actually having an open platform that means that you can kind of accelerate your investment should you want to, is something that's important to consider when you're thinking about, you know, software providers. And then, okay, so we've made a decision in terms of our software provider. What about the implementation overheads? How big a project is this really going to be? And I think, you know, our counsel throughout all of this session is that you can start small, and you should start small, and you should grow over time. And there are some fundamental functions to look out for. There are some, I guess, you know, questions that can be answered in kind of a different way if you think about them. So, as an example, really common one. I've got this big library of previous tenders that I've run in Word document or Excel format or whatever. And one of my fears about implementing e-sourcing and getting it off the ground and getting it running is that I'm going to have to spend ages deconstructing that library and rebuilding it in the e-sourcing tool so that I and any other users can access that electronic library to build tenders in the new tool. And just the thought of that task, you know, can induce a level of paralysis. And it's a valid approach, and it's a valid issue, you know, one that we often help customers with by formatting and uploading those templates as part of the implementation process. But in reality, it's a concern that you can pretty much put to one side, because even where customers do build out, you know, extensive clause libraries, what tends to happen is that they often don't get used. Why is that? Because ultimately what users are looking for, of course, is e-sourcing's capacity to cut the time involved in running tenders massively. So rather than building a sourcing event or a tender by stitching clauses together, this is what happens. So this is our system dashboard. It's our sourcing dashboard on screen now. And if I drill down into an actual event, as you can see here, I've got a feature here, or a button here, which just allows me to copy that event. So I can make a copy of this event and copy that event over to a current project or another project that I have access to, as you can see from the text there. And that, of course, brings across all of those historical questions, all of the different sections that I built that event out of, the suppliers that I used last time, and of course, all of the audit and scoring. So rather than create a huge library of clauses, which then just gathers dust, simply running one event on the system gives you most of what you need to then quickly and easily create the baseline for events 2, 3, 4, and so on. And with each new event further adding to that history and making the process even easier and quicker going forward. So rather than trying to build this huge library that you can then draw on in the future, the simple practice of running one event on the system, as I say, gets you 90% of the way there to then running every subsequent event. And when it comes to actually implementing a sourcing solution, here we see the stages that we go through with a new client to set up the solution, from discover, design, develop, and deployment. That on the face of it can appear a slightly intimidating project, particularly when it's expressed like this in the form of a Microsoft project plan. But it is actually condensed into a very short time period with comparatively little overhead on your team. So it really doesn't take a lot to get from initial contract award to a sourcing event being run. Your full sourcing system set up shouldn't be more than a couple of weeks, including the workshop, the feedback from that workshop, all of the config of the system and so on. So it is a very quick time to value. And one other tip here, I think, nothing, of course, helps you get things going better than running a real event on the system. It's like driving a car. You can play all the driving games in the world, but it's different when you actually get behind the wheel. So make sure that your chosen vendor, as part of their training program, is happy to work with you on creating and running a real life event to kick things off. That makes it real. That gets things bedded in with confidence, allowing you to move on to the next step of your roadmap then, which means reaching out to a wider set of stakeholders. So, talking about stakeholders, Gita's going to come and talk more about strategic sourcing shortly and the different kind of models you can apply, whether centralized or center-led and so on. But whilst you might want to start out just in the procurement team, and that brings huge efficiency gains to your work, there comes a point at which you, the purchasing function, become the bottleneck. And even though you can process much more because you're sourcing electronically now rather than manually, having everything go through that central team still limits your overall possibilities. So you need to ensure that you can include stakeholders in the solution deployment over time across the business. But that's something, again, that can also start small and yet have a pretty big impact. But it is one of the more difficult process challenges. You've got the old dogs who refuse to be taught new tricks. You've got very often senior figures within the organization who take a mule-like stubbornness of approach to the fact that I'm not going to engage with a new technology system, I'm not interested, I can barely turn my laptop on, kind of thing. So what you need to look for is features in your chosen solution that allow you to bring even those kind of stakeholders into the fold easily, frictionlessly, and even if that's unwitting from their perspective. So let me give you another example again. So I think a really good example of this is RFP scoring. That's generally a nightmare. You get loads of RFPs back from suppliers by email. You send out the documents by email to those stakeholders that need to review them. Some of the questions need to be reviewed by IT, others by legal, others by finance, and so on. You've got to redact sections that they shouldn't be able to access. You've then got to collate all the feedback and feed those back into the documents. You've got to try and somehow create an audit of those responses so that if somebody asks you in 3 years' time, why this was scored that way and who approved this section of this RFP, you've got some evidence to that fact. But then equally, we understand trying to get ahead of legal and HR director, or even ahead of IT, if you're going to say, people who are just resistant to logging into a solution and will complain about it all day long, is very hard to make stick. So how do you accommodate them and make sure that you also get all of the process benefits, the audit, the visibility, and so on that a system brings? Well, the system, of course, firstly allows you to set what answers a given stakeholder should have access to. So it's very quick and easy to say, okay, finance function, I only want you to give me your evaluation of this one section, or these 8 questions, or these 3 paragraphs, whatever it might be, simply by going through a checkbox, and therefore all of the superfluous information disappears. They don't get to see it. It doesn't confuse or, you know, worst case scenario, actually show them stuff that they're not authorized to see in the supplier response. But then subsequently, what you can do is export those questions into an Excel file for them to answer offline. But since you've identified that you're in the system, that you're exporting these answers on behalf of somebody else, and then you re-import them on their behalf, so the system knows who is responding, even though you're downloading on their behalf, you don't sacrifice any of the features or the audit trail. You know, it's just as if they'd logged in themselves and answered online. But in point of fact, they're doing it offline. So your old dog learns a new trick without even actually realizing it. And then with certain more amenable stakeholder communities, you can begin engaging them to initiate events too. You know, starting with something like the quick quote functionality. So this is in our system again. You know, here engineers, storesmen, maintenance workers, and so on can manage what they often are, you know, given responsibility for, which is a 3 quote commitment. And that's in a simple process that caters exactly to that requirement. So it's quick and easy to create this very simplified version of an RFQ, where you get basically fill out some header information, drag and drop any attachments or add attachments as required, and create any notes that you might want to send out to the supplier. You can enter, you can upload, or you can simply attach, of course, you know, a bill of materials or a selection of goods and services that you want pricing for. Choose your suppliers to invite and whether they exist on the system already or not. You know, all you need is a name and an email address to invite suppliers, and they'll get a link via email. And throughout, you then get clear visibility of progress, you know, who's accessed, who's responded, who's declined, and of course, what their answers are, so that you can make a selection for those along with your full audit, so that you can then easily see what those responses are, who should be selected, you know, for the whole thing, for each line, or somewhere in between. So it is a very fit for purpose, again, process to a particular stakeholder community within your organization that empowers them without overwhelming them with technology. And finally, you know, the means to kind of winning hearts and minds can also involve a bit of theatre. So if and when you actually get to running electronic auctions, you could consider what we term a popcorn event. You know, it's a bit of razzle dazzle where you're selling the positives, showing people what can actually be achieved. So in this case, a client of ours in the USA who'd never run an electronic auction before, gathered, as you can see here, a big audience together to see what it was all about as they ran an auction for, in this case, aluminium extrusion. And the event, you know, was attended by about 10 suppliers and was really got active participation from about 5 or 6. And their incumbent contract price was just over $2 million. The auction winning bid represented around $100,000 or 5% savings for the customer. So successful event, but just as important, you know, it brought a skeptical business community within this organization to understand what the process was, how it could benefit the business, and what the bottom line returns looked like. And now, of course, you know, they run auctions all the time. So getting those stakeholders on board, you know, can be one of the toughest challenges. It can seem like climbing a mountain, but a combination of the right approach and, of course, the right software platform really eases that path to success.
Right, so by now you've heard from Daniel what it takes to implement our sourcing software. So let's imagine that you have got the system set up, procurement team is using it, you have now introduced stakeholders to the new system and already seeing some great gains in terms of efficiency, audit, trail, cost reduction, and so on. So in the next couple of slides, I will look at the strategic sourcing elements. So what models you can apply, why that is important, and how you can approach strategic sourcing so it doesn't feel too overwhelming or daunting. But what do we actually mean when we say strategic sourcing? And there are many definitions for it. Strategic sourcing can be defined as a holistic and structured procurement process that aims to leverage the buying power of your business and minimize the supply chain risks. So really, it's starting with the evaluation of your current spend and suppliers, identifying the need to buy a product or service, running a competitive tender process, all the way through to project implementation, savings tracking, contract life cycle management, and supplier management. So ultimately, it is the process that helps to, I guess, align your suppliers to the goals of the entire business and manage the risk in your supply chain. So we started centralized by focusing on the procurement team and then building out. But where do we go next? And as the first step, we recommend to assess your current performance from a strategic procurement perspective. And that means identifying your current structure, capabilities, processes, further technology that you might need to succeed in the long run. So creating a clear procurement vision for the next 1 to 3 years. And different organizations are at different stages of maturity cycles. So the systems and processes that would be appropriate for one company may not be for another. So it's really about being very honest with yourself and determining your strengths and weaknesses of your procurement team and designing a change program that's relevant to your business and where you are as a function in your maturity cycle. So as a step one, we recommend at looking what your procurement governance model is today. And traditionally, there are 3 main models: decentralized, center-led, and fully centralized. And you can see all 3 of them have their pros and cons. And here's really where every company needs to make a decision where it wants to go. In our view, decentralized model is great for customer satisfaction, but it does not really leverage from the highest point. But here again, technology can be an enabler to give you greater visibility if that's the case. But as I say, the company needs to decide what is more important, local customer satisfaction or leveraging from the highest point. And what we've seen from our customer base is that center-led platform really aims to promote cross-functional collaboration and foster highly agile, structured, efficient teams. But you may ask why the need for structure and that functional agility. Again, what we found across our customer base was the significance of a center-led procurement function, which has helped them to bring a balanced structure with highly inclusive teams. Also, the wider research shows that the majority of the leading procurement organizations have adopted centrally coordinated procurement teams. So they tend to centralize strategically important initiatives and delegate their tactical procurement activities. In contrast, most procurement followers have no centrally coordinated procurement. So I guess that's quite telling. As a step 2, looking at what specific actions will set you on a more strategic path. So as Jenny already talked about, some steps that you would probably already be engaging as a procurement professional to source products and services. But it's about having clear, consistent rules of engagement that can help support strategic sourcing approach. So looking at how you formulate your sourcing strategy, how you engage and negotiate with your suppliers, how you implement the project and monitor performance and track savings. So having a consistent and standard approach can really enable efficient project management, help ensure that appropriate stakeholders are involved at the right stages, and drive effective implementation and promote the sharing of best practices. And then going a level deeper and looking at a specific sourcing strategies that you can apply. So by now you've got a couple of successful online tenders under your belt. So maybe time to start negotiating more strategically. And the things that you could start thinking about perhaps is identifying or classifying your sourcing activities based on complexity of how complex those activities or those projects are versus spend and value or strategic importance of a category. So, for example, high complexity, high value procurement might need a multi-stage tender with price and qualitative attributes and a complex evaluation mechanism running in the background. On the other hand, low complexity tenders such as commodity items or services with clear specifications could deliver quick wins through competitive e-auctions or quick quotes. And in terms of technology, so starting to think wider and building on what you already have. So starting to really approach sourcing as a strategic advantage, leveraging category sourcing, using digital templates, promoting online collaboration, doing evaluation, tender evaluation online, analyzing your tenders, awarding suppliers through the system, and so on. Perhaps also thinking about introducing a formal supplier onboarding process. So looking at what key information you hold or wish to hold on your supplier profile, such as, what are the accreditations that you require, certifications, policy documents, what's the financial standing or risk profiles of those suppliers. So capturing supplier data based on different categories, languages, currencies, and so on. And then how do you approach contracts? So thinking about optimizing agreements, how the contract lifecycle is managed, perhaps investing in a digital library, having automatic renewal alerts, automatic workflows of approval, electronic signatures, and much more. And then from the ongoing supplier relationship management. So perhaps considering segmenting your suppliers into different tiers. So thinking wider, who are your strategic suppliers? Who are your operational or tactical suppliers? And can you introduce a formal framework for managing those suppliers in different tiers? So in the past, many traditional procurement teams have been accused of looking at price alone, being too tactical or reactive rather than proactive, sometimes working in isolation from the rest of the business in a silo approach. And this lack of cross-functional collaboration really can risk poor supplier selection, and a lack of transparency also provides mistrust of procurement. Because wider, sort of what is the why in the wider or macro level? It's not just about running one tender. It's not about driving savings from one project. It's about not just winning the game as a catchphrase, you can see here, but to continue playing and winning the game. So we've kind of covered some of the what and why elements, which leads us now on to how to get there. And I guess remembering here that delivering a change program can be the hardest part of the transformation, and it does require discipline, structure, collaboration, and persistence. So the key is really to identify common building blocks to get executive buy-in and identify not only outcome goals, but also process goals. Because in reality, true longer-term thinking is less goal-oriented. It's not about any single accomplishment. It is about the cycle of multiple refinements and continuous improvement. So ultimately, it is your commitment to the process that will determine your progress. So how can you start making changes to your practices and processes that we talked about earlier? Starting small is key. So too often we convince ourselves that massive success requires a huge action. Just like with implementing e-sourcing solution, and you will recall Daniel's point about trying to eat all elephant at once. Well, there is no need for that. You should start with one piece at a time. And changes that seem small at first will compound into great results if you're willing to stick with them longer term. So the power, for example, of marginal gains or 1% improvements. Perhaps starting with just a couple of categories before tackling more complex ones. This will help you to build momentum and share best practices. Before thinking about implementing a full digital templates library, perhaps it might be worth just reusing past events that were successful, and that way formalizing the way that the information is gathered and used for specific categories and building on that. All levels of change are useful in their own way. The problem often is the direction of change. So how do you stay on track in the midst of competing priorities, emergencies, and daily pressures? What can help you is creating feedback loops. So staying on track and adapting your approach if needed. So perhaps you send out regular 360-degree surveys or facilitate user groups and best practice forums to get that feedback. And as Daniel mentioned before, bringing in the expertise that will question the status quo and grow and nurture the sourcing champions. So really it is about being consistent and taking steps every day that will lead you to your vision. And last but not least, never stop adapting, because the vision that you set today may require many course of corrections if it is to be successful several years down the road.
Fantastic, thanks, Gita. And I think that marginal gains message is a really important one. We talk about starting small and growing over time. That continuous improvement and reassessment. Both obviously feeds into ultimately a path towards excellence, but means that again you're starting at a very achievable baseline and just growing from that over time. So I think that's it's a super message. I'd just like to finish off now with a quick look at ROI, because even though sourcing solutions pay for themselves incredibly quickly, and in a very straight line relationship actually between investment and returns, you still have to make that business case, of course, for investment up front. So just a few examples of different kinds of organizations that we work with. To begin with, before I get to that, I guess that there are a range of soft benefits. Again, those are quite obvious, and we've touched on some of them. Certainly, the quality, the consistent data formats, the visibility, that electronic access to data and communications, and visibility, of course, means audit historically. That better communication between stakeholders, between buyers and suppliers, an improved level of understanding across the organization, and ultimately time savings as well. And we see those time savings as being massive. In most cases, we see around an 85% savings in terms of the time and the resources required to run a manual sourcing event versus an electronic one. And that time saving also translates into, of course, significant additional capacity within the team. So here's an example of a small clothing retailer we work with, and we did some basic spend analysis with them. It was a relatively new procurement function. They were running tenders, but not in any particularly formal or structured way previously. And if we just took a conservative assumption that said that electronic tendering enabled them to run twice the number of tenders that they historically did per annum, which again is a super low ball on that estimate. And we reduced the value of those tenders by 50% to account for the fact that the highest value categories are already being manually tendered currently. Then our 100 million retailer above would secure an additional $250,000 a year in savings simply through the extended capacity for running sourcing events, for effectively bringing more categories under management of a sourcing process. And I mentioned how quickly, the financial savings stack up. So one of the UK's leading gym chains, for example, that we work with, saved £1 million in contract savings from just 5 sourcing events in their first 6 months of operation. Things like £300,000 on a towel contract alone. But you also see, again, some of the ancillary benefits that spin off from that, such as a big reduction in the supplier base, 46% in this particular case in the course of the first 12 months. And while the financial imperatives are naturally vital, so here we have a leading wildlife charity, there are other significant wins too. So they've made big savings on some of their categories: laptops, soft toys, insurance, and so on. But by having a supplier qualification process as part of their electronic sourcing environment, it means that they can also pay really good service to some of the other things that are really important to them, making sure they're working with local suppliers, making sure that their suppliers are properly accredited and sign up to the right level of standards around, obviously what are absolutely fundamental sort of policies and processes for an organization like this in terms of things like environmental accreditations. And then finally, again, a leading university here. So again, not just how much money can we save, but also how can we drive real change into the organization and underpin some of the fundamental kind of policies that we uphold as an organization through things like the Green Gown Awards, which this organization was able to win 2 consecutive years having implemented e-sourcing, which is very much focused on the Green Gown Awards, so the higher education sector, again, environmental, sustainability, credentials, awards that these organizations go for. So the returns in every respect, not just financially, but to support things like business ethics, like CSR, are immediate and they are obvious, and we can provide no end of supporting material to help out with business case development. If you'd like any from us, again, just use the question function to send us a message and let us know if we can help you out with anything like that. So it's just a quick piece on return on investment. There's obviously a lot of detail that we can go into on that front, and again, we'd be very happy to do so offline, but conscious of time and that we need to draw things to a close today. So I'll hand over to Jenny to give us the final lowdown on today's event.
Wow, Daniel, thank you so much. I think we have covered so much content in this webinar. I hope that this has really addressed some of your concerns and how to get started. Again, this is, sourcing has been around for so long, and yet we still need to understand how can we take the first step. So I hope you've got lots of information that reassures you today, whether that's about process, whether that's about technology, and anything in between that in terms of, the case studies and so on. So lots of information today, which has been really exciting and interesting for us. So a couple of roundups really from me in terms of looking at some key takeaways here and just some things to go forward with. First of all, every organisation can source electronically. Hopefully you've understood that from what we've presented today. The barrier to entry is so low in terms of technology and just getting started. That's a message we really wanted to get across today. On the second point, start with your quick wins. Don't try and eat the elephant in one go, as Daniel put it earlier. Start with those quick wins and build from there, including your processes. You don't need to have everything at the start. Start with impressing your organisation, creating those quick wins. Next is securing the broader stakeholder buy-in. There is nothing like trying to get this promoted within the organisation to make sure it sticks, make sure that really embeds into the organisation. E-sourcing should be wider than your procurement team. It's about the organisation and getting them involved as well. use this opportunity to engage with a larger pool of suppliers. This is one of my real pet passions, really, is seeing the real positives around e-sourcing, not just about the financial returns, but also about what it can enable you and also your supply base as well. It's so much easier to engage with that larger supply base. E-sourcing makes that supplier management so much more efficient, you know, and global, truly global. Use e-sourcing as that springboard. E-sourcing is part of that strategic procurement area of the whole procurement life cycle. It's a platform on which you can really build out your strategic procurement function. So you can build up from there in terms of spend analytics, and you can build down from e-sourcing to contract lifecycle management. Use it as that springboard to create a strategic platform around procurement. And finally, the all-in cost from software to time is often recovered in one single event. I'd say more times than ever, it really is recovered in one single event. So there really isn't that barrier, as we said at the top, there is not that barrier to entry in terms of moving forward with e-sourcing. It's so simple to move to that next step. So I hope this has given you some real food for thought. With that, I would like to draw this webinar to a close from Daniel, Gita and myself, and also to remind you to submit any questions that you have, any interest or anything that you'd like to learn a little bit more about. Please submit those via the question function on this webinar, and we will respond to you directly to your questions. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you found this useful. Finally, as well, the webinar recording will be available afterwards, so you can take a deeper look and share that within your organisation at your leisure. Thank you very much to my colleagues, Daniel and Gita, on this webinar, and from myself. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks all. Bye now.